Hello there, David Roach here, Independent Strategy and of course Quantum Economics. I wanted to talk to you today and to make, as a result of the conference of the Communist Party in China, to make 7 points about China and draw then some conclusions about what that means for the world around us. Now, the first point is the most temporary, which is zero COVID policy. This is a part of Xi thought, so it's part of ideology. It's also, of course, based on the fact that China simply does not have enough emergency beds and enough vaccinations of old people who would end up in those emergency beds to make a liftoff of the pandemic in any way socially, politically tolerable. The point, however, is that being a part of Xi ideology, and he being a man who, what you see is what you get, what you hear, what he writes is what you get, puts the ideology of Marxist-Leninism way ahead of the pragmatic issues of the economy, or even the happiness of the citizens. So it's going to stay, and it's going to be an economic impediment, certainly for the first half of 2023, and quite likely longer. The second point I want to make about China is the conference confirmed the new global disorder. It was a demonstration of raw power in many ways. If it had an economic signal, it was the removal or sidelining of people who might have been deemed vaguely economic reformers, and their replacement by people who are loyal to Xi himself. I think what it does is cement the ideology of self-reliance. That whether you look at it politically, in terms of global relations, or economically, China is now going to be essentially a country in business for itself, which puts everything else in second place. Now that falls into the global disorder, which I've been advocating, in which the world splits into 3 bits. One are the liberal democratic alliance around the United States, but including Europe and the G7 countries. And the other is the Chinese Russian axis, authoritarian and anti-democratic. And the third are the people countries who take a stance of a curse on all their houses and refuse to join one side or the other in the conflict about Ukraine, which is, of course, really a conflict not only about Europe or America's position in the world. It is a conflict about whether we are going to have a rule-based international order or one dictated without law by dictatorships and authoritarian states. These are the Indias, they're the Brazils of this world, who really have no moral or ethical position on what is right or wrong in Ukraine, and support whichever side serves their economic interest or geopolitical interest. That is a big message for the world as we go forward. The third element is Taiwan. It is quite clear that Taiwan is not going to join China, and therefore China is going to join Taiwan. Whether this is done through an outright invasion, cross-straits invasion, extremely tricky, 80 miles of very rough water, whether this is done by an economic blockade or pinpoint attacks on things like Taiwanese semiconductor, which are key to the world's supply of nearly all sophisticated chips and about 40% of all the world's supply of all sorts of chips. We don't know. What we do know is that this is now reunification of Taiwan is now part of the Chinese constitution since this conference. And that Xi has said if he can't deal with it politically, he'll deal with it militarily. And I believe him. And I believe this will happen sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, but before Xi leaves office. And it will make Ukraine look like the trailer before the main movie. Not only because the Taiwanese will fight, not only because landings of military forces in rocky mountainous Taiwan is going to be very fraught, but because China is a part of the global economic system, which Russia is not. Russia was always a producer of energy and a few minerals, some of them critical, but it was never a part and parcel of global consumption and investment in the way that China is. And for that reason, China is capable of inflicting enormous damage on the world, but it is also in a position where the world can inflict enormous damage on China. If 70% of the smartphones in the world are made in China, then if they were embargoed, we'd have to do without our smartphones. But the price of smartphones would not replicate the price of oil, as in the case of what happened when an embargo was put on the Russia. Oil price went up and Putin got more money. An embargo on China's participation in global markets of manufactured goods, principally consumer goods, would knock between 5 and 10% of China's level of GDP. Not the growth rate in GDP, it would just drop by that amount. So I would say that Taiwan is an accident waiting to happen, even if it is a policy which is being planned to incorporate all the lessons which the Chinese military can learn from Ukraine. The fourth is a legacy problem of over-leverage in China and very poor quality bank lending, very poor quality assets, which dominate the domestic economy and still do. Working off these loans is not simple. There is only one way of doing it. That is to cut the value of the loans and to cut the value of the assets. Shuffling them around like a trickster with 3 timbals in a carnival and hiding the bad debts under one timble or another, leaving us guessing where, is not going to solve the problem, because the weight of the bad loans and bad assets, the legacies, are going to weigh on the future growth of the economy, not just the past. And you cannot solve the problem without writing them down and taking the economic losses. And that is simply not being done. If there is one section where this is very key to how we see the economy developing, it is in property. Now, one of the ways in which the Chinese citizens were made happy under Marxist-Leninism in the last 10, 20 years is owning their own houses to the tune of 80% of the population. And the prices go up every year. So the mortgage loans they take out, being of low interest rates, they make a big equity gain every year, feel richer, feel better, and all is well. That trick cannot be repeated. Property development, housing contributed probably between 20 and 30% of Chinese growth during that time period. And you are now in a balance sheet recession, which flows backward from the property sector, from the individuals who own houses, back to the developers, back to the construction industry, back to GDP. It is simply not going to go away. And if Marx said religion was the opiate of the people, I would disagree. I think housing is the opiate of the people, and it's no longer going to be there as a stay for individuals' household satisfaction or political support for Marxist-Leninism. This goes together with the ideological rebirth of the state-owned enterprise. Very few people have noticed, but state-owned enterprises have been growing as a share of GDP. The drop finished under Deng Xiaoping, and now they are the selected heroes of the state-dominated economy. If you go through the profit cycle in the last year during COVID and the period in the recovery after COVID, where were the most profits made? Well, actually, the private sector did very poorly. Foreign equity companies did even worse. Where the money was really made in state-owned enterprises. Closely linked, of course, to the supply of things like steel and cement, iron ore, coal. But that is not the motor of a high productivity, high growth economy. That is the motor of an economy which is dependent upon a backward-looking interpretation of Marxist-Leninism, in particular Marxism, in order to grow the economy. It can grow the economy domestically, not really in terms of globally catching up with more sophisticated economies. But what it cannot do is to make the economy into an Asian growth miracle. And then finally, the seventh point is demography. It's very simple to explain the Chinese demographic dilemma. If for decades you had a one child per couple policy, a one child policy, so every child had two parents who worked to bring up that child, which is outrageously expensive. Then there comes a point when the happy parents retire, such as is happening now. And then you only have one child working because the child has grown up to support two non-economically active people. That is exactly what has happened to Chinese demography. The working population is shrinking, and therefore it is extremely difficult to make a case for booming productivity, which is linked to investment, which is linked to the productivity of that person being able to reproduce what was available when China was industrializing and labor was plentiful. I will make one other point. Women of childbearing age in China are having less and less children. More importantly, if you take to bits the analysis, you will find that the higher the education level of women, the less children they want to have, because it will end their careers. It will end their ability to earn money. And it is outrageously expensive to bring up children in China. Do I think that that demographic policy is critical? Obviously, it's incredibly critical, probably more critical than any of the other things I've told you about. But it was not even mentioned, let alone dealt with, at the summit of the Chinese Communist Party. That gives you a measure of how ideologically motivated the summit is and how poor the long-term economic thinking is. Now, what does this thinking leave us with? It leaves us with confirmation of a China that is at risk of becoming increasingly domestically frustrated, more likely to exert military pressure or create war with Taiwan. It leaves us firmly with the thought that the core Chinese thinking, that the West is decadent and declining, and it is the innate destiny of Marxist-Leninism or socialism with Chinese characteristics to pass it out and reign supreme on the world stage. That is going to be proven wrong. And the result of that is confirmation of what I started out with, which is the world is splitting into three parts: the liberal democracies, the Russian, Chinese axis of authoritarian states and the indifferent world playing one off against the other, but getting no favors of the emerging markets such as India, Brazil, South Africa, and I can go on. That's the news. Don't give up hope. And don't forget to turn off the lights. Talk to you soon.